Last week, I wanted to convey to you not only the labor of slavery and slaves, but also a sense of the patriarchal and racist nature of the institution, how the system, in a way, incorporates everyone into its perpetuation. Africans, men, women, and children, small and big planters, the landless workers, plantation mistresses. As Frederick Douglass suggests in his description of slavery, slavery acted as a fatal poison of irresponsible power. That is, the institution corrupted and distorted everyone involved in it. The cruelty of some mistresses against slave women and their children, the seemingly unchecked power of plantation owners to do just about anything they wanted, the divisions that developed between African Americans and the slave community itself. These are some examples of these corruptions, these divisions. Yet, I don't want to leave you with the impression that slavery is this totalizing system, that the institution of slavery enters into individual lives, particularly African Americans, so completely that there is no room for individual expression or collective action or community, bounded by but not completely defined by slavery. So, I want to begin discussing in some detail the slave family and community. The southern plantation was unique in the New World because it developed a monogamous slave family. In sharp contrast to the South, the general imbalance in the sex ratio among Latin American slaves severely restricted the development of monogamous arrangements. In Cuba, for example, according to the 1857 census, there were 164 males for every 100 males between the age of 12 and 60. And on the countryside of Cuba, the difference was even more marked, with there being 191 males for every 100 females between the age of 12 and 60. Of course, this imbalance is mostly due to the planters' general lack of interest in reproducing the slave population and preferring to import more males than females from Africa. The number of females to every 100 males in the United States was about 95 to 100 in 1820, and by 1850 it's about 99 per 100. It's basically even. In fact, the sex ratio among slaves was more nearly equal in most southern states between the slaves than it was between whites. The family, while it had no legal existence in slavery, that is, slave masters were not obligated to recognize slave families or slave marriages, the slave family still was actually one of the most important survival mechanisms for African American slaves. In the family, black slaves found companionship, love, sympathetic understanding, sexual gratification. In addition, they learned how to avoid punishment, to cooperate with other African Americans, and to maintain self-esteem. However, frequently families were broken. It was primarily responsible for slaves' ability to survive on the plantation without becoming totally dependent of and submissive to the plantation owners. While the form of family life in the slave quarters differed radically from that among free blacks and whites, this doesn't mean that slave families failed to perform many of the traditional functions of the family. That is, the rearing of children, for example, the creation of community values. Slave families performed these functions just like free families, both black and white. Since slave parents were primarily responsible for training children, they could cushion the shock of bondage for them, help them to understand the situation, teach them values different from those the owner tried to instill, and give them a reference for pride other than the owner. Although slaveholders sometimes encouraged monogamous relationships because of their religious views, they generally did so to make it easier to discipline slaves. A slave who had an emotional attachment to a spouse or a child was less likely to be openly rebellious or to run away than a single slave. The threat of being separated from family was often sufficient to subdue rebellious married slaves. The courtship patterns in the quarters differed in many respects from that of whites. In many ways, these patterns reveal a combination of both American and African ritual. Traditionally, Africans use metaphor, indirection, storytelling, poems, songs, riddles, and symbolic language in courtship and betrothal rituals. Courtship in the quarters was based on a fairly formalized ritual involving the posing of a series of questions to determine the availability of a partner. This verbal duel of sorts varies slightly from state to state and was taught to the young by the old. African American slaves generally believed that in order to win a mate, a young man or young woman had to know how to talk. The ritual consisted of riddles, poetic boasting, innuendo, figurative speech, and something of a test of wit. A central concern of this process was the asking of questions to determine whether a young man or woman was free to court or whether an individual would be accepted as a suitor. For the most part, men initiated courtship. As in most courtship rituals, flattery was constant. Young men wasted little time demonstrating how they regarded young women. Poetic allusions were common and were similar in structure to African ones as promises and pledges. While men most often were the initiators of courtship in the quarters, women controlled by their answers to the questions the pace, the length, and determined ultimately the success or failure of the wooing. Initially, the woman's reactions might vary from indifference to slight interest. She challenged the young men to pique her interest, so a young man's initial inquiries might elicit a promise of a response as soon as he proved himself sincere. While this was the general pattern, young African American slave women did not hesitate when she met someone who was attractive to her. Instead, she answered the questions of this person without ambiguity in ways to indicate her desire for him. Often, young women initiated the ritual by trying to determine if the young man preferred them. Young slaves did much of their courting at plantation parties on Sunday and Saturday nights, at corn shuckings, at molasses stews, and at dances. One favorite pastime at the parties were ring games, which enabled men to kiss women. In the process of courtship, male slaves often had to obtain the consent of the parents. In some cases, the slaves were engaged for as much as a year before their union was consummated. In the meantime, the prospective husband prepared a cabin and furniture for his family, and the prospective wife collected utensils she would need to establish a household. Love was no small matter to slaves and represented both a triumph over conditions and a major crisis. Many slaves vowed never to marry and faced separation from loved ones. Many slave men wished to marry women from another plantation rather than their own. They did not want to marry a woman from their own plantation and be forced to watch as she was beaten, insulted, raped, overworked, or starved without being able to protect her. Such sentiments revealed some of the central issues of slave marriages. One was the inability not only of men but also women to fully protect their spouses and children, which points us to another underlying issue, which was simply the fact that owners had the final word in regard to slave marriages and families. Within the quarters, African American slave beliefs about what men and women should do in many ways developed both within the context of slavery and within the context of spousal and parental obligations. Ultimately, the practical application of these beliefs provided a weapon for joint resistance to slavery. While separation was a fairly constant threat, those unions between husbands and wives and parents and children that did survive often endured for many years. Households tended to be large. Families with 8 living children were not uncommon. Most of the work black women did for the slave community resembled the colonial system of household industry. Well into the 19th century, throughout the South, slave women continued to spin thread, weave and dye cloths, sew cloth, make soap and candles, prepare and preserve foods, churn butter, and grow food for the family table. Slave women mastered these skills with the aid of equipment considered kind of primitive at the time, and skills passed on from generation to generation. Slave women's work for other community members challenged the owner's authority in direct ways. As the person in charge of food preparation for both black and whites and their own families, women at times secretly fed runaways and kept them out of harm's way. Children growing up as slaves face contradictory experiences that reveal both the importance and the fragility of family life under slavery. Young children often enjoyed substantially greater freedom than their elders. Although very large plantations sometimes had nurseries, most children received relatively little supervision. With their parents and older siblings at work, they spent much of their time playing among themselves, and often with local white children. Many ex-slaves remembered that as children, they were literally unaware of being slaves. Still, children were hardly untouched by slavery. In a variety of ways, owners interfered extensively in their lives, bringing some to the big house to serve as domestics and assigning others light chores that became increasingly burdensome until they were put to regular field work, usually between the ages of 8 and 12. Slave children learned at an early age that they had to conform to the wishes of 2 sets of authorities, their parents and their owners, both of whom were involved in their upbringing. Such competing claims on their loyalty could be confusing. Evidence of the owner's authority was very apparent in their dealings with adult slaves. Children who saw their parents verbally or physically abused without resisting could not fail to draw the appropriate lesson about where real power resided. At the same time, parents struggled to provide children with love and attention and pass on family traditions as well as customs and values. With the help of friends and relatives, parents sang to their children, told them stories, exposed them to their version of Christianity, brought them up to be extremely careful of what they said in front of whites. As children aged, they became increasingly aware of their unfree status, sometimes through incremental discoveries, sometimes through a traumatic event, a whipping, a comment by a white playmate, a sale of a loved one that brought home the reality of their situation. Some slave children learned early and others late that they were slaves and their white playmates stood in a superior position to them. The moment might come when their parents had to explain matters so as to protect them from the dangerous breaches of plantation etiquette, or when the attitude of a growing white child began to change, or when the master or overseer superseded parental authority in some dramatic way. On many plantations, it came at the beginning, for African American slave children might be commanded to call even a newly born white baby young massa or young missus. Some black youngsters learned the difference when they found themselves being punished for the whites' actions and had no way to protest. The break could come when white children began to go to school. At that point, the difference in condition became obvious because African American children often wanted to go too, and occasionally the white children wanted them to go as well. Parents seem to mix a good deal of affection with a great deal of discipline. Both were needed to instill in children a sense of their own worth, regardless of their condition, and the tools necessary to survive that condition. While parents would often sing and tell stories to their children, they did not hesitate to instill lessons by other means as well. Learning when not to speak, whether it was back at a person or about a conversation held in the slave quarters, was vital to the survival of slave children to adults. Learning to accept a certain amount of personal abuse and the punishment of loved ones passively was one of the most difficult lessons to learn. Striking out to protect a loved one from being abused could get you killed. So actions taken by slaves had to be measured and calculated. The lessons the slave children learned about conformity were complex and contradictory. Recognizing the overwhelming power of whites, parents taught children obedience as a means of avoiding pain, suffering, and death. At the same time, they did not teach unconditional submission. Instead, children were often taught to fight their masters and overseers to protect their relatives. W.H. Robinson, a former slave, remember his father telling him, I want you to die in defense of your mother." Listening to stories of runaways and seeing slaves interact in the quarters, the slave children had many models of behavior. In fact, they saw parents playing two contradictory roles. In the quarters, for example, where they saw their parents disparaging whites for their mistreatment, being the head of household, protector, provider. On the few occasions when children saw their parents at work, they were obedient and submissive to the owner. Sometimes children internalize both these traits that they saw and the behavior they viewed as a means of surviving. Undoubtedly, slave parents had to carry the heavy responsibility of teaching their children how to survive in an extraordinarily dangerous world. There was little margin for error, and they couldn't simply let their children learn from their own mistakes. A slave who grew into manhood or womanhood without the special kind of self-control required in a system of strict racial subordination could get him or herself killed. Apparently, the etiquette of race relations had to be beaten into some slave children by their parents simply as a matter of survival. Fathers and mothers imposed a strict discipline and enforced it. The tales and stories that children were told symbolized the presence of African culture in the formation of African American communities. These stories also had very practical implications as they provided slave children with a sense of history, often of their American past, but also commonly of their African heritage as well. Elders would speak of the old country and describe the landscape and animals. They would also tell stories of capture and the Middle Passage. And while these stories were not told to all children and may have faded as the number of native-born Africans in the United States decreased, they did not disappear entirely. Oral traditions ensured that stories were often passed down to successive generations. Stories also instilled moral lessons, survival skills, and a sense that the condition of slavery did not have to enslave their minds. Trickster tales allowed for a certain amount of psychological release from the inhibitions and prohibitions that slavery imposed. The situationers repeated tale after tale. The strong attempt to trap the weak, but are tricked by them instead. Stories of the weak outwitting the strong must have at least provided some break from the growing awareness among slave children of their status. Now, while these stories tell of the importance of intelligence, the ability to think on one's feet, and the ability to pretend or mask, all skills African American slaves needed, they also seem to describe the limits of a community consciousness, perhaps pointing out that when all was said and done, that each slave had to rely on his or her own wits and not necessarily the community to survive. The community could not be forgotten, could not be forsaken, but neither, because of the ever-changing nature of the lives of slaves, could the community always be depended on. The recurring themes of these stories suggest that slavery instilled something of an individualistic worldview among the slaves, and that slaves' sense of community was much more complicated than simple unity in the face of white oppression. That ultimately, slaves, slave families, slave communities supported one another, taught lessons to one another, passed traditions to one another, but the ultimate lesson that all of this taught slave children was that they needed to be able to survive on their own.